Greetings from the very late side of the galaxy. This video was supposed to be out 2 weeks ago, but then these two videos happened and we got a bunch of new people. So let's go right back to the beginning and introduce this series for a second time. Have you ever wanted to know more about the myths behind your favorite transient? Then boy howdy, do I have the series for you. It's called Housamo Heroes, where I walk you through everything you need to know about a certain transient. If that interests you, then you should keep watching. If that doesn't interest you, then keep watching anyway. I could use the numbers. Do be sure to like and subscribe. The next Housamo hero will be Tezcatlipoca, so why don't you subscribe to know when it's out while I start today's video. Since I lack the brain cells to do any clever alliteration, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Today's Housamo hero is Tezcatlipoca. Here's your spoiler warnings for chapters 9, 10, and the Happy Illusion Festival event. Tezcatlipoca is a feline? We'll call him feline. Tezcatlipoca is a feline transient from the world of El Dorado. The world based on South American but primarily Aztec mythology. Tezcatlipoca is one of the few people in this game who's not a student but a grown-ass man. He presides over Penitencia Academy located in Narima Ward. Tezcatlipoca is also a member of the Warmongers who also feature quite heavily in-game. Moreover, Tezcatlipoca is one of the Warmongers' leaders, seeing as how he's the world representative of El Dorado. In the lore of Housamo, a world representative is the major figure of their world's faith. It's their job to uphold their world system at any cost, lest their entire world fall apart. Considering the faith of El Dorado is sacrificed, Tezcatlipoca did his job very well with perhaps too much enthusiasm. That's something I'll get into later because right now we have to talk about his rule and role, which we don't know, but hey, what else is new? We do know his artifact is that mirror he wears on his wrist like a really cumbersome watch. And his artifact does a lot of stuff, dude. It's really weird. Mostly, it lets Tezcatlipoca control a shapeless darkness which he uses to transform and make more mirrors. Mirrors created using his smoke all reflect each other, meaning you can use them as security cameras. He can also implant his darkness into people, making them his vassals so he can possess them. Because Tezcatlipoca is a world representative, his mirror is also a pillar artifact. You know how time in Tokyo has been looping? Well, a pillar artifact is an artifact made of such dense dark matter it can resist the tides of time and retain memories. This means Tezcatlipoca remembers all past loops and can bestow these memories like every pillar artifact. Due to this, he can lock people inside his mirror, trapping them in a world of his or their memories. Dude has a weirder grab bag of powers than Superman. Like, damn, Lifeunders, just pick a power and stick with it. While Tezcatlipoca's grab bag of powers may seem random as hell, it actually makes more sense when you look at his inspirations. And who would have guessed? That's what we're doing now. Unsurprisingly, Tezcatlipoca is based on Tezcatlipoca, the Aztec god of the north. He was a major focus of Aztec religion, being their main deity and appearing in many stories. He had an association with jaguars, which he often used as a disguise to trick people. Although Tezcatlipoca had a bigger association with darkness, which was represented by obsidian. Obsidian is a glassy volcanic rock, and the Aztecs used it for two main things. First, obsidian was often used to make mirrors, which Tezcatlipoca was set to look through to gain an omnipotent understanding of the world. And secondly, the Aztecs used it to create their main weapon of war. I'm not even going to try pronouncing it, but I'll put the words on screen if you want to try yourself. And it makes sense considering Tezcatlipoca had a huge association with war and violence. He was a patron to soldiers and was said to sometimes wait at crossroads to challenge any passing warrior. He was even patron to the Aztecs' basic schools where young men would get an elementary education and learn the ways of war. He was also the focus of one of the main rituals that would take place during the 5th month of the year. It would begin with his priest selecting a war prisoner to stand in Tezcatlipoca's place. They'd live in luxury, dining, eating, and sleeping very well, wink wink. At the end of it, the prisoner would be carted up the temple steps, breaking flutes along the way, and have his heart torn out in sacrifice. On one hand, terrible way to go. On the other, you gotta live like a literal god for an entire year. Pros and cons. Many of his temples were built facing east to west. Because despite his association with darkness, Tezcatlipoca was still a sun god. You see, despite Tezcatlipoca's penchant for destruction, he was also a god of creation. The most prominent feature in these stories is his brother Quetzalcoatl. Together, they created the ground beneath our feet by slaying a crocodile monster. Tezcatlipoca actually sacrificed his foot as bait, but his sacrifice was apparently worth it because it created the world we live in. Despite this bit of teamwork, Tezcatlipoca would prove that he is indeed an older brother by fucking with Quetzalcoatl, tempting Quetzalcoatl into shameful acts which earned the deity a painful end. Tezcatlipoca was often depicted with yellow or red stripes on his face and a missing leg from his fight for creation. And I'm guessing that most of you have already been able to make some connection to Housamo's version. Just for the purposes of differentiating the two, the transient will just be called Tez and the myth will be called Tezcatlipoca. To begin, just like the myth, Tez does have yellow markings on his face. And the thing about his missing leg happened verbatim in Housamo's story, and you can even see the shiny obsidian prosthetic. And the leopard print on his outfit might be a reference to Black Panthers not really being a thing. You see, Black Panthers are usually jaguars or leopards with a melanistic mutation, not their own distinct species. We practically see the sacrificial ritual in-game happen to Hombre Tigre when he gets his heart ripped out. And the celebratory nature of the ritual explains Tez's festive nature and why it was chosen for the festival event. Tezcatlipoca's association with war and warriors explains why Tez is a member of the Warmongers. In fact, just as Tezcatlipoca was the patron deity of their war schools, Tez leads Penitentia Academy, a military boot camp located in Narima Ward, which is in the Far East, just as Tezcatlipoca's temples were built facing east. And do you remember how Tez kept mirrors everywhere in Penitentia to watch his students? Well, Tezcatlipoca did the same thing to watch everyone, which is actually a huge invasion of privacy. And to be honest, not totally unexpected for a guy like Tezcatlipoca or Tez either. Both of them are known for being just a wee bit problematic. In one story, Tezcatlipoca tricks Quetzalcoatl into accidentally getting drunk, breaking his religious vows. And to make matters worse, his sister was a virgin priestess, and Quetzalcoatl, let's just say Fushi gave him a thumbs up. The ending differs, but Quetzalcoatl either cremates himself or exiles himself into the ocean or underworld. Thankfully, Housamo's version of events is different, and since we're talking about it, let's begin Tez's backstory. His story begins with him and his brother Quetzalcoatl fighting to create El Dorado. In this battle, Tez lost his leg, but in the end, he and his brother created the world. Xolotl enters the scene somewhere. He's their brother, but they don't ever mention how he came about. Tez and Quetzalcoatl were known to clash, and it was often extremely violent, but it remained to be in good fun, for the most part. Somewhere around this point, Hombre Tigre sacrifices his heart to Tez to become his vassal. These good times don't last because things come to a head when Xolotl is selected to be a sacrifice. Tez is pushing his brother to accept his role, but Xolotl cries and runs away, fleeing El Dorado entirely. Tez is absolutely baffled, unable to even tell what went wrong when Quetzalcoatl makes his move. Using his rule to rend the earth, he erases any trace of himself and leaves El Dorado too. And this act shakes Tezcatlipoca to his very core. He begins to question the nature of their world, screaming out at the night sky, asking why he was abandoned when he's brought to Tokyo. From here, we know he joined the Warmongers and met back up with Hombre Tigre, making him the leader of his honor guard. And specifically in the main quest, he came across Mr. Mononobe after he forsook his role. He ended up letting him stay in Penitentia within Mahakala so he didn't fade away. And it's a little after this that the player first meets Tezcatlipoca in the main quest. I know I usually do the summary around here, but seeing as how that's where the audience retention drops off, I want to try something new. Instead, I want to try taking a look at some of Tezcatlipoca's best moments and analyzing him as a character. If you want to know his story, you can check it out in-game, or even go to the Housamo English archives. There's a link in the description, check them out, they're pretty cool. Now that I've given them a shout out, let's take a minute to take a look at Tezcatlipoca's character. I joked about it before, but Tez is really rather unique in Housamo because he is actually a grown adult. Life Hunters always gives the grown-ups a tinge of maturity that I find fascinating. They always speak of their regrets and the lessons they learned, which they more often than not hope to impart. Like Mr. Mononobe with the player, or Shino with Moritaka and Tadatomo. And for Tez, that student is Yasuyori. From Tez's 5-star, we can deduce that he has a lot of sympathy for Yasuyori since he's torn between his own desires. Yasuyori wants to stay at Yoyogi Academy with his friends, but he also doesn't want to harm them. He wants to stay at his commander's side and be a loyal soldier, but he's so reluctant to follow orders. And when Yasuyori does make those tough decisions, Tez doesn't begrudge him for it in the slightest. For example, when Yasuyori finally switches sides, Tez respects and accepts the decision. I suppose it ties back into the nature of the thing Tez loves, that being sacrifice. When you're torn between two options, one's gotta give. You have to sacrifice something. Which I suppose ties back into another big thing about Tez's character, that being the acceptance of sacrifice. Think of when Penitentia finally falls, Tez just kind of accepts it and moves on. And when Yasuyori decides to defect, Tez doesn't hold that against him, he just lets it happen. When someone makes that decision, when someone sacrifices something, Tez prides himself on not resisting it, which brings me to the end of Chapter 10. You know how Tez is ultimately defeated in Chapter 10 when Yasuyori drags those painful memories to the surface? It's poetic irony because he himself was going against everything he stood for. You're supposed to accept sacrifice and face your pain, but he couldn't accept Quetzalcoatl's sacrifice when he cut himself out of El Dorado. Or face the pain he brought his brother when he ceaselessly sacrificed parts of his own flesh. Tez prides himself on standing true and accepting everything life throws at him without hesitation. In the Happy Illusion event, it's the reason why he decides to have his replica body keep all of his faults. And when he sees the system of Penitentia falling apart, enemies closing in, his world collapsing around him, he just sort of shrugs it off. Which only makes his refusal, his denial to see why his brother left the world, even more poetically ironic. And it's only when he acknowledges his hypocrisy does he fulfill his role, fading away, completely taken out of Tokyo's loop. He kind of reminds me of Ukiura from Bleach, where what kills him is not the sword, but the acknowledgement of something incompatible with his existence. I could speak more about Tez's character, in fact I might make a whole video about that, but I need to digress. I do have to talk about Tezcatlipoca's units after all. Tezcatlipoca has 3 units, 2 normal and 1 limited per the usual. He also has main character privilege, so all of his units are different from each other. His 3-star is an infernal bow type unit and its first skill is Smoke Blower. It gives him an 80% chance to inflict darkness on hit and resistance to all kinds of weapon changes. It's a decent enough skill considering darkness is a decent enough status effect considering it blocks CS activation. Next, Claimer of Offerings has him take 800 HP, duplicate buff, and remove debuff to any adjacent units, be they friend or foe. The fact that the skill affects both enemies and allies holds it back, but I kind of like the idea of the skill and concept. Sun Transgressor is his 3rd skill and it comes in 3 different parts. It has a 70% chance to get Reflect debuff and an 80% chance to get attack up after being buffed with increased vertical movement. Honestly, it's not a bad skill because Reflect debuff is pretty useful. And finally, we have Mirror of War, which has a 40% chance of applying possession to enemies in a 2-square diamond radius. It also gives him a damage buff for the immobile status effect. Not a bad unit for what it's worth, but honestly, his 5-star is even better. Its bow type and world attribute, and fun fact, its title of Smoking Mirror is a direct translation of Tezcatlipoca. The only skill the 5-star sorta keeps is Sun Transgressor, and I say sorta because it gets replaced by a skill evolution. His first skill, Smoke Commander, keeps the resistance to weapon change, but it also gives him 2 new things. It adds an 80% chance to inflict Dazzle after being hit, and buffs his darkness application to 90%, which is certainly an improvement. Next is Progenitor of Sacrifices. It keeps most of everything the same, but now it's in a 2-square diamond radius with 100% proc. This skill is a huge step up from the 3-stars version. Next is Sun Transgressor, but since I already covered that and it gets an improvement, let's just cover the skill evolution. His skill evo is called Black Sun Overturning or Black Sun Eclipsing depending on how you translate it. It keeps everything from Sun Transgressor while letting him apply Vigor in 1 square at 90%. It also lets him remove up to 5000 HP from enemies in shot range 100% of the time, but these skills only happen if he doesn't move. I really like this skill in no small part to the if stationary abilities because it means you can move another unit without Tezcatlipoca being dead weight. His final skill, Visions of the Great War, is kind of weird. On turns by 4, it gives him a 90% chance of giving allies Berserk Plus in enemy's possession. Intact on the end, yet again, is that same immobility advantage from his 3-star. I really don't get why he has that advantage when he can't inflict immobility himself. That sums up 2 surprisingly good units with skills that fit Tezcatlipoca very well. His one limited unit is from the Festival of Magic Illusions event. It's kind of convoluted, but Cait Sith involved Baylor because he needed help holding a festival. This also got Tezcatlipoca involved, who then involved the crafters who made him a tiny plush body. And after building up enough happy energy, the body would transform into his whole self rather than staying plush. It's a fire gun unit and it doesn't know when to shut the fuck up. His first skill, Jubilant Revelator, gives Berserk plus at 100% and Spirit at 80% to himself at phase start. Bad skill, don't care, moving on. Next, Sharpshooter applies weakness in whatever range this is and taunts enemies at its center 90% of the time. And, get this, he also gets extra damage against enemies with taunt, which is something I'll get into later. His third skill, Smoky Firecracker, has two parts. First, a 50% chance of giving himself Reflect debuff before being hit, and then a 40% chance to apply darkness to enemies that hit him. It also removes up to 1500 HP from enemies that hit him 50% of the time. It would have been a pretty good skill if the procs weren't doo-doo. And finally, Magnanimous Exonerator. Ain't that skill a mouthful? 10 syllables. Damn. It gives him a 50% chance of getting tenacity before being hit and makes him resist all kinds of poison. It's kind of strange how his two normal units are good, but this event unit, ugh. Its skills just aren't that good. It only gets an advantage against taunts, something that no 2 or 1 star, i.e. most enemies, use. You can't even rely on other units to apply taunt because no other units in the game do that. And to make matters worse, it has a bark every time it inflicts a debuff, which is 90% of the time. Tezcatlipoca, I love you, but the only correct place for this unit is the garbage. Get the fuck out of my sight. His 3-star is a fine unit with nothing particularly offensive, but I'd actually call his 5-star pretty good. It's got this weird, suppressive support kind of playstyle that I actually kind of like. If you have all of them, Tezcatlipoca, Ellie, and Zurong actually do pretty well together, so you can vibe to that. And speaking of vibing, we're actually heading towards the end of this video, so why don't we go ahead and do his relationship chart. Claude likes Tezcatlipoca due to their mutual affection for warfare and violence. And Baylor likes Tezcatlipoca since they're basically the only friends each of them have. Arachne dislikes Tezcatlipoca for reasons? I don't know. Might have something to do with the Summer River event, but that's untranslated, so On the flip side, Tezcatlipoca himself likes most of everything about Yasuyori. And he dislikes Jacob since his artifact can hard counter Tezcatlipoca since he can banish his darkness and return memories. And he dislikes Devastar because his desire to replace what's lost spits in the eye of the concept of sacrifice. Overall, I really love Tezcatlipoca. Not because I simp, he's just not my type, but hot damn, he's one of the best written characters in this game. It's a tragedy he's dead, so I'm just gonna have to hope and pray he gets into another event. Oh, and before I forget, here's the fun fact. The name of his charge skill, which I won't try to pronounce, was a real term used to refer to followers of Tezcatlipoca. It roughly translates into, "We are his slaves." Be sure to like and subscribe because I have an announcement planned for next week, and of course, here's my stamp of approval. Without further ado, this is your host Fuuri signing out.